Hey everyone. So I think that's us starting now. So good evening. It's so exciting to have you all here with us tonight, celebrate this incredibly powerful anthology, This Arabist Queer. I cannot tell you how excited I was to hear that this was coming out and then to actually get my hands on it and just to read through it at least twice over so far. And joining us here this evening are Manat Tahawi and Ambara Salam. So just a few things before we get going. First of all, you can obviously you can buy the book off of the Lighthouse Books website, from which you're viewing this video right now, and also make sure to start thinking of questions for our speakers just throughout and popping them into the chat box there, because we'll be reading them off later on when we're doing our audience Q&A. Perfect. So. And yeah, I cannot tell you how excited I am to be speaking to both of you, just Mana and Ambara, not just for your contributions to this wonderful collection, but for your respective bodies of work just in total. And This Arabist Queer is a collection unlike any other in that it collates memoir writings of 18 queer Arab writers, some of whom readers might be quite a lot more familiar with, such as Mana, Ambara, Zinjo Khader, Hamid Sino, Salim Haddad, with others just using pseudonyms. The editor has done an absolutely incredible job in collecting these writings and giving them space to take shape however the writers choose. And you'll hopefully get a taste of some of these essays as well tonight. So I can convince you to just dig in and see what it's all about. And so as Elias pointed out, this collection pushes back against the sensationalized media stories that try to portray queer Arabs in a particular light that only serves to portray us as inherently other. As if because of the challenges many of us face, we are unable to aspire to do more than survive. And this collection absolutely proves otherwise. This anthology grabs back the microphone, giving us an opportunity to be heard, not just by the Western media, or just the folks who woefully turn a blind eye to us, but by our kin, our friends and families, our chosen families, other queer Arabs who might otherwise feel invisible, and by ourselves. It just, reading this felt like an absolute assertion of, we are here. So thank you so much to both of you for contributing to this incredible collection. And now, just to get the show rolling, I feel like I've spoken enough. And it's time to pass on the microphone and introduce our speakers who will be giving us short readings from both of their essays. So, Manat Tahawi is a feminist author and founder of Feminist Giant newsletter. And also, you can just see her book hanging out here, The 7 Necessary Sins for Women and Girls, which is an absolute incredible read. Just kind of the way that you managed to use rage to just to break that silence, break the all of the culture of shame, and just to kind of allow people to strive for what they actually want and to break the binds of cis heteropatriarchy that is keeping us all down. And then afterwards, we have Ambara Salam, as a Palestinian Scottish author of Things Bright and Beautiful, and Belladonna, which is also here. And I'm sure if you want, you can even buy those books off of Lighthouse Books. So go and get those right now. So I'll pass on the mic now to Mana, who will be reading first from her essay, The Decade of Saying All That I Could Not Say.
Thank you, Mo. Hello, everyone. My name is Manat Tahawi. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I begin everything as I always do with my declaration of faith, fuck the patriarchy. And this is an excerpt of my essay. It took Ireland and Bosnia to force a reckoning with my nesting dolls of secrets. Of all the countries I've traveled to for work in the Western world, I've always felt most understood in Ireland. Unlike many other European countries which prefer to deny and distance themselves from talking about where I'm from, Egypt and the surrounding region, and say it's shit over there, Ireland understood it's shit over here too. The stranglehold of the Catholic Church on everything, from politics to education to geopolitics, fostered understanding and empathy whenever I spoke there. In 2015, Ireland became the first country to hold a referendum on marriage equality. The reckoning that such a referendum required inspired Ursula Halligan, one of Ireland's most high-profile journalists, to come out at the age of 54. At the time of writing, I am also 54. She wrote poignantly about a secret she thought she would take to her grave. Quote, "I was a good Catholic girl growing up in 1970s Ireland, where homosexuality was an evil perversion," she wrote. "It was never openly talked about, but I knew it was the worst thing on the face of the earth. So when I fell in love with a girl in my class in school, I was terrified." Halligan's words gave me whiplash. When I was 16 years old, I was a good Muslim girl growing up in Saudi Arabia, where homosexuality was an evil perversion. I too fell in love with a girl in my class. But unlike Halligan, and this I now realize had been my denial and distance, I was in love with a girl and a boy at the same time, and I thought everyone else was too. I didn't have a word for it, and I couldn't explore it beyond feeling jealous when the girl I was in love with told me she was in love with a boy, and crestfallen when she didn't say I too was an object of her love. It would take 3 decades until I kissed a woman, but tellingly, it would also take another decade until I kissed a man. At around the age of 17, I began having nightmares that I'd married the wrong man. Even when at the age of 21, I left gender-segregated Saudi Arabia for the more relaxed Egypt, my country of birth, I wanted very little to do with men. I was that good Muslim girl who was waiting for marriage, and much like Halligan, poured myself into work. When I read Halligan's coming out essay, I marveled at the almost identical teenage love for a girl, and I wondered how our journalism careers had helped us hide. I knew that I, at least, was hiding in plain sight. Was I brave? Of course I was. I wrote articles that exposed the human rights violations of a regime that tapped my phone, had me followed, summoned me for interrogation at state security several times, threatened to imprison me, and eventually made good on its threats a night on Mohammed Mahmoud Street in November of 2011. Was I brave? Of course I wasn't. I couldn't say for the longest time that I desired men and women. How could I, when for the longest time, men alone were off limits? How was I to figure out what I desired when desire for anyone was off limits? I'm just scrolling because I don't want to read forever. Adrienne Rich, a feminist and literary icon, defined compulsory heterosexuality as the ways by which a patriarchal and heteronormative world socialized women into heterosexuality. And I was taught a specifically Egyptian and Muslim version of it. I was raised to wait until I married a Muslim, Egyptian man to have sex. And for the longest time, too long, I obeyed. I couldn't find anyone I wanted to marry, or more truthfully, I didn't want to find anyone I wanted to marry. I became fed up with waiting and fed up with wondering, what if it did not have to be a man? In 2013, I finally kissed a woman. I'd always assumed that when I had a threesome, it would be between 2 men and me, but it turned out to be with a man whom I was seeing and a woman we invited to join us. It was also me who reached out and kissed her. And when the man left the room to use the bathroom, it was me who reached out for her once again. Still, I used no label and did not further explore my attraction to women. In 2015, when I was getting to know the man who was now my beloved and anchor partner, he told me in one of our earliest email exchanges that he was bisexual. I replied that I was polyamorous. I knew by then that monogamy was not for me, but I was still not ready to say that I too was bisexual. Learning how he explored and then acknowledged his sexuality has been a tremendous help, one that I credit with the progress I've made in shattering this final nesting doll of silence I've held onto for so long. While I wasn't ready to say I was bisexual, I did start to call myself queer. I considered my polyamory to be a form of rebellion and resistance to heteronormativity. The liberatory and revolutionary potential of queerness became especially poignant for me when I first visited Sarajevo in 2016. I went to Vilna-Vlas Hotel and Spa, which had been used as the largest rape concentration camp during the Bosnian War, and to Srebrenica, site of the worst massacre in modern European history. The previous night, I'd been to a queer club in the Bosnian capital with queer friends. It was a small club that played a mix of Western pop and dance songs, along with domestic folk dance music. The club was packed mostly with men who frequently kissed. I held on to these images, the men kissing all around me, as I danced with my friends, the next day as I reeled at the atrocities that had been committed in the places I visited. The queerness I carried out of that radical space of openness and the transgressive sexualities that surrounded me were the perfect antidote to the horror of militarism that had been unleashed at Vilna-Vlas and Srebrenica. Men should kiss each other more often and kill less, much less. One of those men in the queer club in Bosnia kissed me. I'm bisexual, he told me. So am I replied.
Thank you so much, Mona. That was absolutely beautiful, and just everything that you express about kind of like queer joy and just queerness as being revolutionary and as breaking kind of like those binaries this cis heteropatriarchy tries to impose upon us, just very much kind of like echo deep inside me. So thank you so much for reading this, and just as a start to the book, it was absolutely incredible. So thank you. Ambara, the floor is yours.
Hi there. So I'm faced with the horrifying proposition of following Muna, which is just terrifying. So I'm going to keep this quite brief because there is literally no way to follow that with keeping my dignity intact. So my piece is about unheld conversations. So just before my second novel, Belladonna, was published, I gave both my parents a copy of the book. Now, they both read my earlier novel, my first novel, much earlier in the process of publication. But with my second book, it was not until weeks before publication that I gave them a copy. So Belladonna is far from autobiographical, set in the 1950s, and the story takes place in a silent convent in northern Italy, which is a place I've never even been. But unlike my first book, Belladonna is written in the first person, and it's narrated by a young queer Arab woman. The book is about the pain and toxicity of the narrator, who is obsessed with another young woman. The plot revolves around a love triangle between three queer women. So it is a very queer book. And as I handed over this soon to be published book to my parents, it was with a certain amount of trepidation, anticipation. I left them to read the novel and waited for the conversation about my sexuality that we'd always avoided. Both of them read the book, and we never had a conversation. My straight friends were baffled by my distress about this. Surely it was a good thing, they said, that my parents had avoided a quick conversation about queerness. The book was out, no one had said anything, which they encouraged me to take as a form of acceptance, if not approval. I was in a relationship with a man at the time, so why was this even bothering me? I felt the kind of gathering accusation that I was experiencing a millennial sort of self-indulgent, narcissistic kind of angst about a harmless form of erasure. But in a large, rowdy, nosy Arab family, even a change in hairstyle is fodder for teeth-sucking, cigarette-waving phone chains. Every minor life decision, every petty complaint about a colleague, every pound and weight fluctuation is inspected and eye-rolled, gossiped and rehashed, passed between an extended network of loved ones who make it their personal mission to frolic in your business. But apparently, my identity wasn't worthy of the same fuss. I had expected a fuss, and I felt that I was owed a fuss.
Thank you so much, Ambara. That was beautiful. I think when I first read it, that phrase, harmless erasure, just kind of like stuck to me and just felt like it stabbed me, because there is that feeling of kind of sometimes not being seen. There is some sort of safety in that. I remember when I was younger, kind of my sister telling me essentially that my parents had a conversation with her about my sexuality and just kind of like wondering about it. And then afterwards, I found myself kind of, when I heard that had happened, I found myself disappointed that they didn't confront me, even though like obviously it's keeps me safe to have kind of like stayed hidden, especially living in Egypt under their roof at the time. But yeah, so I really felt that line.
I connect to that a lot. I think that's why I was interested in looking at sort of silence as a kind of metaphor for how a lot of queer Arabs choose to or are forced to live, because there's a certain complicity in your own, I guess, erasure for a lot of people, whether it's a matter of safety or whether it's a matter of convenience.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, because silence obviously plays a huge role in what both of you have written as well. And Mona as well, you talk about this kind of like nesting doll of silence, where even when you kind of like try to dismantle one thing, another thing kind of rears its head, and you have to start kind of picking that apart. So I was wondering just to kind of, just if both of you can elaborate a bit more kind of on the role that those silences kind of play within your work, and especially kind of choosing to set the novel in a silent convent. I want to hear about that.
Well, for me, I mean, that I think talk about this a bit in the piece, but actually I interrogated that later. I came back to the reason why I'd written the book and set it in a silent convent. At the time of writing, I had assumed that this was a kind of literary device in order to create more tension. But when I really thought about it, I thought, God, maybe I've actually done this deliberately, because this is the only environment in which the complicity, silence, and sort of convenient eye turning of the sisters in the novel mirrors my own experience. And I think that, without wanting to like psychoanalyze myself, I think there is something to that.
And I think it also somehow also shares in that responsibility of silence. It's we're all responsible for kind of like breaking through it together, and just because the strict imposition of it. Sorry.
I think the silences that we have to confront like take on many shapes and forms, political, social, and personal. What I call in my book, my first book, Headscarves and Hymens, Why the Middle East Needs a Sexual Revolution, the trifecta of misogyny, where we talk about the revolutions that began in Tunisia in 2010 and then spread across the region. And I call them strictly political. I mean, everything is political, obviously, but these were revolutions and uprisings against the dictator in the presidential palace, and everybody could understand those kind of revolutions. But those revolutions are not enough. And I think, that's what I recognized that I'd been doing with my own work for the longest time, because I was a journalist, I was a news reporter, mostly with Reuters news agency in Egypt. And to great personal risk, like I said, I talk in the essay. I didn't read from it when I read from the excerpt about the very real harm that the Egyptian regime caused me. The riot police broke my arms and sexually assaulted me in November of 2011, and my phone was tapped and all of that. And that was, the consequence of my work, my targeting that political silence in Egypt. But it's not enough to just target the dictator in the presidential palace. And that's what I realized about my own work as well. And I think that's where the revolution really was pivotal for me, because I say that what happened to me that night in November of 2011 on Mohammed Mahmoud Street was a form of dying, that the Mona I used to be died, so that I could become the Mona that I am now, but she bequeathed me her silences. And those silences were the social and personal silences. And so I've begun to write about the revolution against the dictator on the street corner, public space, and the revolution in the home, in the bedroom, in the kitchen, or, the domestic, personal, very private space, basically. Because when I talked about these things with, say, cisgender men, they would often say, it's not the time to talk about feminism and gender and I don't know what, Mubarak and the police and Sisi now and all this stuff. But that's because they could only recognize state power and how state power hurts them. They don't understand, being especially cisgender heterosexual men, that the state, the street, and the home together hurt the rest of us. So this is where women and queer people, for lack of a better term, really need that revolution against the trifecta of patriarchy or misogyny, the state, the street, and the home. And the silences have to be broken in all three areas.
Yeah, that's Incredibly put. And yeah, I remember just during that time, even as you were saying, when people were having those discussions about what's going on in the revolution, and when people would bring up just issues of gender-based violence or queer issues, it would be as if you've kind of like sidetracked the conversation into something that is kind of unnecessary or extraneous to what we're fighting about. It's like, Anna, but that's, it's as if we're thinking about some higher form of thought, whereas it's kind of like, if we want to liberate the people, we have to actually try to liberate all the people. Otherwise, your revolution is conditional and your revolution is still patriarchal. It will just breed the same kind of like rotten fruit that has always been there.
Exactly that. And you see it happening in Egypt and other countries across the region where, you know, there's been an uptick in femicide, the horrendous crackdown against the LGBTQ community in Egypt, you know, and that's it. Like you're saying, Mo, you know, we all deserve liberation, not just a certain group of men who deserve a certain amount of power from the state, and then the rest of us can wait. You know, there is no waiting.
Exactly, because in that waiting, in those silences, still a lot of people suffer. It's not that if we don't hear about queer people that there is no problem. It's that the stories have kind of like been repressed, which is just, again, the amazing thing about a collection like this, is because it does bring people's stories forth. And it's kind of like what you were saying as well, that it takes it out of the sphere of the theoretical. It's no longer kind of like some mental exercise that we're talking about. These are actual people's lives, and these are actual people's experiences, and it's expressed in their words. And that's, yeah, again, the revolutionary power of writing, actually using your voice, which quite a few of the other essays as well just to talk about here.
Something that came up at the book launch actually is that Paul Burston asked us, who was this, when the contributors were writing their pieces, who were they imagining that they were in conversation with? And what I think came out very powerfully is that the contributors, including myself, felt that we were talking to other queer Arabs. And because of those kind of overlapping state, social, political, personal, domestic, psychological, you know, cloaks of silence, actually it has felt like a really revolutionary act to be able to have an open and public conversation with other queer Arabs in essentially what is quite a safe space, because so many of the other contributors also operate within those sort of bell jars. And I think that's been really powerful.
Yeah, exactly. And yes, and I was thinking, just kind of the amount of risk that people carry to actually kind of like put their stories forward. And yeah, sorry. Yes, and just picking up on another point, and just the intersectionality kind of like that you both express and talk about within the book. You both kind of like voice it very well when you talk about kind of just the recognizing kind of like your intersecting personalities as something that gives you power and actually kind of like allows you to find the tools to fight the way that you need to. But as well, you talk about kind of the intersecting personalities as giving you access to spaces that you feel like you would otherwise not have access to. So I was just wondering if you can speak to that a little bit.
Well, you know, in 2005, I moved back to Egypt for a few months. I was already living in New York City, but I moved back to Egypt for a few months to join the protest movement that back then was kind of under the umbrella term kifaya, you know, that word, the Arabic word, enough. And that really was like one of the germinators of the revolution that you know, of 2011. And we would stage these protests that, you know, they were really tiny. If we had like 100 people, would be ecstatic at that, you know. And the maximum I think that we had was maybe 1,000, 2,000 in Tahrir Square, something like that. That was like the maximum we would get. And then we'd be chased away by the police who'd, you know, beat everyone up. But I remember that people would say all the time, you know, other people fellow protesters would say that it was really important, regardless of how tiny the protest was, because we were breaking the barrier of fear. And we would see, you know, fellow Egyptians looking at us as they were taking the bus home from work, or just looking at us as if we were insane. And, you know, really worried for us because, of course, you know, they thought that we would be disappeared because so many people are disappeared and continue to be disappeared. And this idea of breaking the barrier of fear, I think, became especially pertinent for me with the idea of risk and consequence, and what privilege I had, and how much space that privilege I had gave me to take risk and to then suffer consequence. Because I thought, okay, if we're going out on the street to protest and risk our lives so that we can break down the barrier of fear, how can I possibly ask or hope to inspire anyone to break down the barrier of shame or guilt or anything else, unless I break down my own barrier of shame, guilt, and everything else? And that's when I understood that the personal stories, especially, all the various identities that comprised me, that I had kept very separate, that's where the nesting dolls came in. I had to start connecting them, and I had to start talking about why it was that I couldn't figure out who I desired. And it was because I was raised to wait to get married in a very specific way, in a very cisgender heterosexual way. And then what it meant that I was bisexual, but I couldn't say I was bisexual. And then what it meant that I was struggling with monogamy. And so what then? And so to break down the barrier of fear out on the street is one thing, and to break down the barrier of fear, shame, and guilt in our personal lives is another thing. And I think it's driven by a lot of privilege that, you know, allows me to write an essay under my own name, and I recognize that. And so I think I like to think of the book as this kind of like baton that we're passing along between, you know, amongst ourselves, because there are several people, as you mentioned, who've written under pseudonyms, understandably, because it's extremely dangerous. So those of us who can risk and can survive the consequence, I think must risk at much greater levels than those who can't. And that's where I think we need to navigate all the intersections of privilege, risk, consequence, and the ways that we use them to break down any kind of barriers.
That's, yeah, exactly. And that makes perfect sense. And it just kind of reminds me about what Amber was saying before about kind of just the risk in publishing this sort of thing, and especially kind of publishing it here versus kind of publishing it in Arabic, where it's totally different. And I'm thinking back about another book actually called We Wrote in Symbols. I don't know if you're aware of it, but it's also by Saki Books. And I'm sure you can also buy it from Lighthouse Books. And it's all just women and non-binary people's writings from the Arab world, and it spans kind of just since antiquity, Jahiliyyah period, up until now. And there, but I remember kind of there being a whole debate around essentially their ability to use lust or versus desire as part of the title, because of how people would associate that, and especially kind of like when wanting to consider what it would be like to bring that like those writings forward to actually people within within Egypt, within Jordan, and yeah, just in other Arab countries. Yeah. And just to remind everyone, we're getting a few more questions into the chat. So if you have any questions that you want answered, just to keep putting them through. There are a couple of really good questions so far, but we'll carry on chatting for a little bit more. And so, yes, Amber, I was hoping just you would just talk a bit more about as well intersectionality, as we were discussing, and just kind of what you were saying in the essay about it allowing you access to various spaces and what that means to identity.
Sure. I mean, I don't know that I can express it any better than Muna, but I mean, I think because I have a really particular place of privilege, I'm a super white passing Arab in the diaspora, and that, as I talk about, grants me access here to particular spaces where people kind of don't identify necessarily as the other. And so that carries with it a really, it means that essentially as an individual, you inhabit a very weird space because you are both inside and out, and it allows you to kind of exist on multiple simultaneous identities, essentially. And not to kind of extrapolate to everybody's experience, but I think that quite often living as a queer Arab, that there is that sense of existing in a state of multiple overlapping identities that don't necessarily feel like they can be seamlessly combined with each other. Now that is our own internal our own internal grappling with the patriarchy, with the political systems that actually oppress people on a socio-political level. But it also happens at such a micro level of the domestic that it can be really hard to extrapolate those two. And I think that's actually why this anthology is doing such amazing work and being able to unpick some of those moments of conflict, personal and political conflict on the individual level in a very conversational way that doesn't feel like you're having to explain to someone who couldn't possibly understand what it feels like to exist in that space that feels inherently unstable.
I totally understand, especially about the whole idea of intersecting identities that just somehow don't align, where you almost have to explain your presence within a certain space.
Constantly.
Yeah, exactly. It's kind of which is why sometimes it almost I don't know, and I think some of the essays here talk beautifully about that, the idea of coming out as a person of color, as an Arab person of color, especially if you identify as Muslim, where people have carry with that a lot more like the Islamophobia on top of the homophobia and racism, and where you have to almost show that you're worthy of safe spaces sometimes. And that's, it's almost like they sometimes make you erase yourself before they have a chance to erase you. And I think one thing that I absolutely also just loved about this whole collection is the idea of the personal in it. It's not about kind of like some sort of grand unifying kind of like broad stroke idea that's meant to kind of encompass all Arabs. It feels like everyone is actually writing from a space where they're very aware of where they stand, because obviously we've been made to think about it so much. We've been forced into that position, but we've kind of actually, as you were both saying, we've used that to our advantage to actually kind of like know how to grapple with all of these systems of oppression. But it's still, and it's kind of like avoids all of the pitfalls of just trying to prescribe a certain notion of what it means to be a queer Arab. This book, just besides like providing a lot of people's stories, it provides so much space for more people's stories to come through. And I think that is kind of like, just for me, one of its biggest successes. But yeah, and I guess also just, and just so the idea of what about desire? And I think because desire is something that's written about so beautifully, and it's often kind of like something that's almost kind of like erased within queer writing, is that queer people are allowed to put the language to themselves. I'm allowed to say kind of that I'm bisexual, that I'm polysexual, but not allowed to kind of actually feel that desire. It's kind of like you can prescribe that, but not feel that. And I was wondering, and I felt like both of your writing kind of like spoke to that a little bit. And so I was just wondering about the role of desire in your work.
Well, I think that the older that I've become, the more that I write as openly as possible about desire. And I actually specifically also use the word fucking. I'm very particular about saying fucking, because especially here in the United States, they're so fucking puritanical about this. This whole love is love. I mean, of course, love is love, okay? But that's not what it's about. It's not about it's not just about who you can love. It's also about who you can fuck. I mean, we have to grapple with that. We have to sink our teeth into it, because this goes to the heart of everything. Abortion, which is just, the Roe v. Wade being overturned in the United States, talk about possibly reversing marriage equality, all of that. This is about fucking, and saying that word and writing and talking openly about desiring and about lust and all of that, for me, was a personal revolution, because, as I say over and over, I wasn't raised to desire. I wasn't raised to figure out what I wanted. I was raised, in a way that many of us are socialized. This is what you're going to do. You're going to wait until you get married, and you're going to marry a very particular person, and all of that. And I quickly realized that that's not what I wanted, but I didn't have the words for it. I didn't have the experience for it. And so what it ended up being was kind of me snatching desire from the jaws of shame, and it was just having to look shame in the eye and just destroy it. And as I say, I read in the excerpt, how was I supposed to know who I wanted to fuck if I couldn't fuck anyone? How are you supposed to discover this exploration of who you are, let alone this coming out? I mean, I haven't come out to anyone. My friends know who I am, my partners know who I am, all of that, but I haven't done some kind of grand coming out. But so what I often write about, and I've recently been commissioning a translator to translate the specific essays into Arabic, because I want my essays about abortion to be available in Arabic. I want my essays about fucking to be available in Arabic, because I understand how difficult it is to say those things under our own names, especially. So I just began to write more and more about it. And I understood that what I was doing was I was looking shame in the eye, like I said, but I was also fucking the guilt out of my system, because guilt was such a massive part of discovering what I wanted for myself. Guilt over having sex outside of marriage, guilt over having an abortion and then another abortion, guilt over recognizing that I couldn't be monogamous, I just couldn't do it. Guilt. I was just surrounded. So I was like, that's it, I'm gonna fuck the guilt out of my system, and I'm gonna write about it, and use the word fuck, because that in and of itself is a form of revolution, to confront shame like that and topple it, as if I were toppling Mubarak, but in my day-to-day existence, but for real, and not introducing a Sisi, destroying them all,
Exactly, just conquering the dictator inside of all of us. And I just love what you're saying as well about that sense of kind of like continuously breaking through those barriers, because it feels like just that barrier of shame. But as you're saying, it's kind of not just about kind of that once you break through that barrier, that's it, you're kind of done and everything's great. And the effort is continuous, and the effort kind of like it keeps on going, because you keep getting presented with new challenges. As you're saying, the kind of like the upturn of kind of Roe versus v. Wade is a huge blow. And just and this is also something else that I found absolutely revolutionary in these writings, is that they don't kind of, it's not just about the local. Like it still recognizes that just for one group to be liberated, it's we have to kind of like lift everyone else up at the same time. It's not just about it's not just about kind of like one group succeeding even if another doesn't. It's kind of like that's not success, especially when we talk about queer people, and especially queer people of color. Mm-hmm. Because as long as those systems of oppressions just exist, they will be just putting someone down. Mm-hmm. Ambara, is there?
I mean, I think, like Mona was saying, desire, on the personal and the artistic level, it's a radical act. It's an act of transformation, and I think what we see when we strip LGBTQ issues of desire is essentially a form of depoliticizing. because what happens is then you get, like we see quite commonly now in the West, sort of sanitized or stripped back versions of pride, of supporting our trans brothers and sisters, and it all becomes about love is love and rainbows and, you know, glitter, and we're not talking about glitter. And unless we inject the sex and the desire and we reclaim it as an act of personal revolution and joy, and a human right, it's a human right to have desire. Unless we claim that, we're losing such a huge political aspect of the fight for LGBTQ rights.
Yeah, exactly, and that is so beautifully put. And I feel like I might kind of start reading off some of the audience questions as well, because there are a few up now, and don't forget to put more if you have any. So our first question from Kay. Ambara, I loved your novel, and it's so interesting to hear you talk of the metaphor of silence. There is less of a published tradition of queer Arab writing. Did you feel you were missing roots for your work, or did that not matter, or did you draw on other writing?
Thank you very much. I'm glad you enjoyed my book. That's great to hear. I mean, I think, yeah, it's certainly true that there's more and more published queer Arab writing, just even as we speak. I mean, of course, the authors in this anthology, but, you know, there's also, I don't know, You Exist Too Much, for example. I mean, there's all kinds of new writing that's coming out constantly that's just adding to this quite small, I suppose, canon of writing. I think, you know, obviously I'm a fiction writer, so it's different for me when I'm thinking about what I pull from in order to create a kind of artistic world, I suppose. But I mean, it's kind of apt that we were talking about desire just now, because actually that was really what I was trying to channel for Belladonna, and strip back the emotions in the book to really one just of essentially of longing, and of unrequited longing, not to give anything away. But it's because that is such a universal experience. Everybody, it's not specific to queer people. It's such a universal experience, and I wanted it that any reader, whether they were queer or not, to read the book and be able to feel really viscerally that sense of longing, and to experience it. And so to that extent, no, I wasn't really pulling on a body of queer Arab writing per se, but something that really was in my mind. I have a degree in theology. Don't ask me, it's I don't know, it's interesting. And something that I was thinking about as a framework is actually the idea of sort of Sufi, the concept of, within a Sufi understanding of love, as divine and physical, but also one that carries with it a sense of annihilation and personal erasure, and the things that the erasure of self and the death of self that comes with subsuming your identity in love. And so actually that's kind of what I was, obviously this is not queer, what I was doing is kind of using a queer theory reading of Sufi theology, I don't know, maybe that's a very grand way of putting it, in order to think about the personal experience of unrequited longing when you are a queer woman. So that's my question. That's my answer for that.
I love that. And I love the idea of also just annihilation within love, because essentially that is what happens when you kind of absolutely desire someone, when you love someone. There is that sense of that you somehow disappear. And it takes a lot of trust and a lot of self-knowledge to actually build up that relationship and that trust and that safety to feel, because you're essentially giving the person a weapon by kind of disappearing yourself slightly. And This
is mirrored across lots of ecstatic traditions, so it's not just Sufi. We see this in other religious traditions as well. But.
Yeah. And another question from Tanya. Yes, to Polyrapmona. Yes. Yeah, you seem to have struggled less being open about that than your bisexuality. Do you see polyamory as a queer way of loving or a political way of loving?
Thank you for that question. Tanya, I think, right? Tanya or Tonya, thank you.
Tonya, yes.
Tonya, thank you, Tonya. Yeah, you know, it's interesting that I wrote it. So in my second book, the one that you have behind you there, Mo, The 7 Necessary Sins for Women and Girls. This isn't me plugging my book, but this is me just excellent. Bring out both books. Let's plug
buy these
both.
books. Buy them both.
So interestingly, in the chapter on lust, which was the last sin that I put in the book, because I put them in order of difficulty. So the very first one was anger, which is the easiest, and the last one was lust, which I believe is the hardest and the much more absolutely in all its forms revolutionary. I do talk about being polyamorous, and I say that I consider being polyamorous a form of queerness. And I quote from a book on anarchism, from a chapter on queer anarchism. I quote from one of the chapters in that book on how polyamory is a form of anarchism, and the older I get, the older I become, the more anarchist I become. Anarchism is truly much more a philosophy than maybe a political ideology, but I'm an anarchist feminist. And so for me, polyamory is both political, is an approach to love and approach to politics. It's both. I don't separate the two, because for me, ultimately, it's about freedom. But it was much easier for me in The 7 Necessary Sins for Women and Girls to say I'm polyamorous and I consider myself queer, and I will further examine my queerness in another book, because this is not the space to do it. I'm like, I was basically being a coward, and I was chickening out of, writing down my bisexuality. And so I sat with that for a while, and I asked exactly the question you're asking, Tonya. Why is it easier for me to say I'm polyamorous than it is to say I'm bisexual and that I desire men and women? And so when Elias wrote to me and asked if I would write an essay for his collection, I thought, okay, this is it. This is now the time to say what I have. That's why I call it the decade of saying all that I have not, I've been unable to say, basically. So I've spent the past 10 years just going through all the secrets that the Mona who died in 2011 handed on to me. And I promised her that I would go through each and every single one of them. And I hope I'm doing a good job.
You're doing an absolutely excellent job. And especially just because the essay just puts the whole journey forth so beautifully and so tenderly as well. I think sometimes we have a tendency to almost be too harsh on our past selves, as if we should have been kind of like somewhere sooner. But I feel like this doesn't do that. This kind of like recognizes where you were every step of the way, which is very empowering, because I think just each person goes through a different experience, and queer people, especially queer people of color, kind of, as we were saying before, have many things that they need to tackle at once. So it's not that we're kind of like trying to get from somewhere and that there's some trajectory that we're headed towards. We're all just trying to, find the best way to be ourselves. Another question from Layla. How did you both feel being asked to be part of this anthology, and how did you decide what to write?
So how did I feel? I felt a bit conflicted, if I'm going to be honest, because I'm a fiction writer, I'm not a journalist, and I also don't often write sort of confessional pieces. And I've resisted doing that, partly because I feel that I didn't want to perform any kind of identity-based trauma for an audience of people who wouldn't understand that trauma, I suppose. And so that's something that I really resisted doing. And it wasn't until Elias wrote to me that I sat down and thought about whether this was the right moment for me to write something like this. And in the end, I kind of like Mona was saying, I thought, well, out of so many people in the world who are in the same position that I'm in, I have so little to lose, and I've got nothing to lose by talking about my experience. And so it took me a little while to kind of think about what I was actually going to write about. And in the end, it was sort of about those layers of, I suppose, silence and confrontation that you need to, that you internalize when you're going through, when you're actually in this kind of position. I was resistant to it first, the idea, not to the pitch when Elias actually finally approached me about it.
I especially love the line that you have about worrying about veering dangerously close to writing heavy-handed. Yeah, heavy.
Yeah.
Yeah, I love that so much.
It's a slippery slope. That's the thing. You know, if you're an Arab writer in diaspora, you're only ever, I don't know, 2 espressos away from writing about the jasmine in your tata's garden. Like.
Exactly. Oh my God, I love it. So from Paul, I'm so enjoying this. So great to hear sex put back into these conversations. Fuck shame. More desire, less glitter. Are there any writers, queer or otherwise, who have informed the way you speak or write about sex and love?
For me, I would say, and it's the Black lesbian poet and feminist activist and just all around icon, June Jordan, who I quote in my essay and whose words are tattooed on my arm. We are the one we have been waiting for. That's how much June Jordan means to me. So she wrote an incredible essay. It wasn't an essay. She gave it as a talk at a conference, an LGBTQ conference, and I think it was in 1991. And this is how revolutionary June Jordan was. She gave this speech or a lecture on the revolutionary potential of bisexuality back in 1991, because she basically, the essence of her talk, which was then adapted into an essay, was that when you're free, you're unpredictable. And when you're unpredictable, you cannot be controlled. And I love that idea, because everything I do is in the name of freedom. That's why I said I'm polyamorous, because I want to be free. I'm breaking down all these barriers of shame, guilt, and silence, and all of that, because I want to be free. And so this essay of hers is just, for me, it was such an eye-opening way of dismantling all the different layers of sexual silences and shames. And I didn't say how I reacted, because this is kind of connected to Elias asking me to contribute an essay to the anthology. And when he wrote to me, my first thought was, how did you know? Which is a ridiculous thing for me to think, because who didn't know? But my second thought was, yes, I must do this. And I think the reason that I did is kind of connected to June Jordan. June Jordan, Bell Hooks, Audre Lorde, so many of my, especially Black and women of color, feminist icons, for lack of a better term. I don't like the word icon, because we should all be iconoclasts, but they really are icons. They died very young. And we just recently lost Bell Hooks. And, this pandemic that is never ending, it's not over. So I'm not saying, after the pandemic, the pandemic continues. But my beloved's father died in May of 2020 from COVID, and I lost 5 members of my extended family over the past year. So there's so much death, there's so much grief, there's so much grieving. And I thought to myself, you know what? I don't want to die with all of these silences. I said it in one essay on Feminist Giant, that when I die, I want to be buried lightly. I don't want to be buried with the heaviness of the silences that I didn't speak. So I took Elias's invitation to write for this anthology as a way of unburdening those silences that Mona, that I used to be, has given me, because I think this pandemic should have really made us kind of stop and think, what am I doing with my life? At least 20 million people have died. What am I doing with my life?
Yeah, and just reminding us to confront again that kind of like inner dictator, that because obviously just that is essentially what ends up manifesting on the outside, and what keeps kind of systems of oppressions going is that kind of like continuous silence when people don't speak up. And yeah. Ambara?
Well, Muna named the authors the writers that I would have said as well. I mean, Audre Lorde, obviously, Bell Hooks. I think, how can you I mean, that's fun. It's fundamental. You can't not read those writers and be transformed by the way that they think about sex and love and the patriarchy. So I mean, this is essential reading, but I'm sure Lighthouse Bookshop also has their own curated section of radical love and sex criticisms.
I think Lighthouse Books has always been my go-to place in terms of kind of like getting all of those books. They were the first people to hand me Audre Lorde to be like, you have to read this. And obviously Audre Lorde, revolutionary, absolutely brilliant. But yeah, no. And I guess this might be one of our last questions from Jay. What are you working on next?
So I'm working on Feminist Giant, which I write all my essays on. So subscribe to Feminist Giant, it's free. But alongside my essays, I'm working on a couple of books, both nonfiction. I'm not as brave as Anbar. I don't do fiction. I consider fiction authors the bravest of beings. So I stop at essays and I dabble in poetry every now and then. But I'm working on a book called The King Herself, which uses Hatshepsut and the various genders that Hatshepsut took on to examine gender and to examine our bodies, especially as we make our way through this pandemic. And I'm also writing a book on being child-free by choice, and very happily so, called Unmothering, that looks specifically at, usually all of those books are written by and for cishet white women, very privileged cishet white women. So I'm looking at this book. I will be talking to people who are not cishet white women. So I'll be talking to non-binary people, I'll be talking to trans people, I'll be talking to Black and women of color about the choice to be child-free and what it means, especially in these days where all this panic about declining birth rates, this white supremacist fuckery of the great replacement theory, and in China, the Han Chinese pressure to make women have babies because because of their own ethno-supremacy or ethno-supremacist way of fascism. So those are the two books that I'm working on right now. In the future, I might try my hand at fiction writing, but not for a long time.
We will all be waiting, and we will hold you to that. So it will happen eventually, is what you're saying. Anbara?
I am working on my third book right now, which is actually set in Edinburgh in the 1920s. So I can't officially say anything yet, but you may or may not see it on bookshelves this time next year. Yeah, so.
Oh, I can't wait. Oh my God, so excited. And also so excited for everyone to buy this book. So whoever actually bought a voucher, bought a ticket for this event, that is redeemable against the price of the book. So buy this book. And also these incredible books, please. Well, thank you all for joining us this evening. This has been absolutely incredible, and just the discussion is just so interesting, and just I feel like I just I'm gonna go away from this and just start writing notes just to kind of just soak in this beautiful feeling of kind of sharing space with both of you. So thank you. And